So, good morning. Let me just address something real quick. The last couple weeks, some have wondered, hey, what's the deal between the songs and the message? Is Scott forgetting that he's supposed to be on stage? And I can assure you that that is not the case. We're trying something where sometimes we just need to decompress, have what we call a palate cleanse, and so just use that time for transition and for prayer and personal reflection. So we invite you to do that. It's something we're going to try, and it hopefully won't be too awkward. But some people were wondering, they were concerned about me, and so just want you to know I'm okay, and that time's for you. All right, so first of all, let me also say, or second of all, I guess, my name's Scott, and if you're joining us for the first time, I'm glad you're here. And this has been a crazy week, right? Masters in Augusta and spring break, and some of us, parents, we want to pull our hair out, and we're ready for kids to go back to school. And teachers, we love you, but we're ready to give our kids back to you. And I say that. Having your kids lead in worship, and I do mean that, lead in worship, is a privilege and an honor, and it's something that I appreciate and hold dear, and I'm grateful that you have brought your kids and you have initiated them into the leadership and worship in church. It's something that we need, and we are better when we are growing in intergenerational relationships. I cherish some of those relationships I had growing up of people who were older than myself, and even as I was in student ministry of students younger than me, and just seeing where they've come and how they've grown in their faith, it's really something that's a rewarding experience as well as building the body of Christ. And so what we do here, while we may think of it, some may think of it as a performance, it's really more than that, and grateful for their leadership this morning. So having said that, I want to ask you this question. Have you ever met somebody, hopefully it's not you or somebody you're sitting next to, this person is probably a person that you kind of have some reservations about what might come out of their mouth next. And maybe it's a relative and you're like, man, there is no filter. I'm afraid what might be said in public, and this could be a disaster. Anybody know anybody like that? Anybody in this room, maybe? No? I met this person this week. And I say that because my kids and I, we went down for spring break, and Lainey, she teaches at Southern, so she's Georgia Southern, so she didn't have spring break. So the kids and I, the last part of this week, went to my mom's in Jacksonville, and they're members of the Elks Lodge, and I was kind of joking with the people in the back. I was like, Russell was more thrilled to do karaoke at the Elks Lodge than he was singing back here. He was just kind of like, and he didn't even brush his hair. He's just like, yeah. I was like, all right, man, cool. And so anyway, we go to karaoke night at the Elks Lodge. My mom, she wants to parade me around and say, this is my son. And so anyway, I met a guy, and just I've been working on like eating better and losing weight. I've been doing okay, and it's not something I've talked about and been public about, but I'm getting there, and it's a long journey. Anyway, my mom, she's lost a lot of weight, and so I'm feeling this. I've been pleased with my progress, and then this guy, I know this guy, and I won't say his name because Jesus knows. Jesus knows. And he goes, oh, hey, looks like he put on the weight you lost. I was like, I'm going to punch this man right here. I mean, it wasn't like, oh, hey, good to see you again. It's like, hey, you're fat. All right, cool. Good to see you too, person whose name Jesus knows. That I will not say in public, but it might rhyme with lied. All right? Now, this morning, In a way, it feels like sometimes when somebody says something and they don't have a filter, it can feel like an act of betrayal. This, I just let it slide and thought, I'm going to preach about it. It's good sermon fodder, so this is going to be funny. But at the same time, there are things that people say that cut a little deeper. And so even though today is Palm Sunday, and typically we might have palms that we're waving, I'm going to kind of jump ahead to Thursday, because I know a lot of people may not attend, and we do have services on Maundy Thursday and Good Friday. But Jesus enters into the gates of Jerusalem, and he enters as a king riding on a donkey. This is what we celebrate on Palm Sunday, but this is the beginning of the earthly end. I don't want to say his total end. And so Thursday, there is an act of betrayal, and I want to speak to that and how we might experience that and how we might cope with that when we encounter it. And so this morning, I want to look at John chapter 18 and look at how Jesus is arrested. And we may know, so there is this, well, I'll just go into it. We'll just experience it together. How about that? So, verse 1, when he had finished praying, Jesus left his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On his other side, there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now, Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas, a disciple, knows where Jesus is going to be. He knows Jesus about as well as anybody else. And so Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers. Now, a detachment of soldiers, this isn't like 2 or 3. This is 200 to 600 people. That's a pretty huge show of force, right? For a guy who has shown no propensity for violence. Like, what are they afraid of? And so he's guiding a detachment of soldiers, Judas is, and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. And they were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it that you want?" Now, this is telling. They don't say, "You." They say, "Jesus of Nazareth." Hey, we're coming after this guy. We've got a whole army here, and we're ready. We've got our pitchforks, and we're ready to take this guy down. So who's it you want? We want this Jesus guy. What does he look like? I have no idea, but I'm sure he's around. Okay. And they replied, and he replies, "I am he." And Judas the traitor was standing there with him. And when Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and they fell to the ground. Jesus reveals himself here in this moment. And it's something I think really instructive for us. When we are blindsided by the power of God and by the presence of God, it's like sometimes God is at work in our lives and we don't even know it. We don't recognize it. But then when we find it and we see it, we're taken aback by it because it is so counter to what we often experience in our lives. And I have to think that for some of them, they thought, we're falling back. This is not voluntary. Maybe we shouldn't be doing this. Maybe this guy isn't so bad after all. Or some were scared and said, "Oh, he's really a threat. He can neutralize our torches." But again, he asked them, "Who is it you want?" That's kind of funny. Like, they fall to the ground. He's like, who is it you want? You sure you want to do this? And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus answers, "I told you that I am he, and if you're looking for me, then let these men go." So in this moment, even Jesus, he's thinking of others. Then let these other guys go. I'm the person you want. And this happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." And then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" What does this mean? Are you trying to intervene and interfere with what I am called to do? Would you step in the way of what God would have me do? Peter. Peter, he had good intentions. He didn't want to, well, he did cut a man's ear off, so that's not a good intention. But his good intention was to help Jesus. And Jesus intervenes and says, this is not the way we're going to do this. It's not, God's will is not for violence or bloodshed, but for redemption. And at this point, only through the bloodshed of Jesus. Then this detachment of soldiers, with its commander and the Jewish officials, they arrested Jesus. So here, let's just summarize what's happening. We have Judas betrays Jesus and the disciples. Soldiers and officials, high priests and Pharisees come equipped for a fight. Jesus preempts them. Jesus announces who they're looking for. These well-equipped officials fall to the ground. So they're no power for the power of God. They're no match for the power of God, Jesus doesn't resist, spares his disciples. Peter draws a sword, cuts a man's ear off. Jesus sternly rebukes Peter. Not the sword. That's not God's will. And then Jesus submits to arrest. In another translation, he heals the man's ear. Okay? So Malchus was all right. But there are three, I think, different types of betrayal happening. And you might be able to identify with this. There's betrayal from the inside out, and there's betrayal from the outside in. And kind of more specifically, there's a personal betrayal. So Peter, he is, while well-intentioned, he is undermining the will of God. And notice, Jesus asked Peter this question, presumably giving him a choice. Would you interfere with the will of God, Peter? In other words, we don't want to have force without purpose. So Peter, while well-intentioned, is undermining the will of God. And so after these statements on the screen, there's some reflection questions. So if we're undermining the will of God, as we're reflecting this week in preparation for Easter, which is going to be awesome, and celebrating Jesus raising from the dead, where in our lives might we have good intentions but are doing more harm than good? Where we say, well, they mean well, but their good intentions don't end with good results. And sometimes we're interfering where we should not be. That it's not the will of God. One could look at somebody who needs to experience natural consequences. Well, we want to save them from experiencing those consequences. We don't want them to feel pain. That's what love is, right? Well, yes, but sometimes in order, Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. In order for us to love ourselves, we have to experiences the weight of consequences to be able to know what true love really is, in order to appreciate the love that we're loving for others or offering others. That's just one example. But there are times when we step in the way of the will of God and we have the best of intentions, but ultimately it doesn't produce the result that we need or want. All right, Judas is not well-intentioned. So while Peter is well-intentioned and he's opposing or undermining the will of God, Judas is actively opposing the will of God. And he's doing this from the inside out. Isn't it true that acts of betrayal seemingly feel or hit worse with people that we are the closest to? The people that we trust, the people that we thought we could count on, the people that we feel love us, and then something happens and that trust is broken, and maybe that sting is worse than if it's somebody like a coworker or a fellow student. Judas, this one hits hard. And he's opposing the will of God. And so where in our lives are we opposing the will of God? In this case, from within the faith community, but even within our own families or within ourselves, where we say, I have the best of intentions, or maybe I'm just, I don't really, maybe you're here because you were dragged here and your kid's singing and it was cute, and we're all here for different reasons, and the goal is to meet people where they are and lead them to where God, help lead them where God wants them to be. That's what I'm here for. And so, wherever that is, I guess the point of this message is, how might we be more amenable to the will of God in our lives as Jesus was to the will of the Father in his own? How might we do that? And so, thinking about Avengers, Civil War. They were weakened when they were divided. And so, what is that quote? A house divided upon itself cannot stand. We are weakened when we are betrayed from the inside. And so, this was what Judas did. All right, betrayal then from the outside in. The soldiers and the Pharisees are not well-intentioned, and they are opposing the will of God from the outside in. So Judas, gives them the 411 on where Jesus is, and he's like, here, I'll lead you. Mind you, he sold them for 30 pieces of silver, and that's the amount, if you look in Exodus, that's the amount, the going rate for a slave. I mean, he sells Jesus out for slave money, which in a way does not suggest a high opinion of Jesus, or he really needed the money and he was in trouble in other ways. Either way, it doesn't show much respect. And so the soldiers and Pharisees are not well-intentioned, and as well as Judas, and they're opposing the will of God from the outside in. Where in our lives might we be blatantly opposing the will of God by opposing other Christians? I may do this sometimes, as I reflect on this and think, there are just some Christian experiences that are different from mine and that I don't relate well to. The Pentecostal speaking in tongues, like being very charismatic. I don't get that. And also I'm a very reserved person anyway, and there might be times where I crack a joke on that, and I'm thinking, man, am I opposing the will of God by making a joke about other Christians because I'm really just covering up my own ignorance or insecurity, maybe, about that? And so instead of embracing and trying to embrace, as we say, the mystery of the gospel. We cannot know all things there are to know about God and about Christ. And so there is this mystery. That's what's so important about faith. It says in the book of Hebrews, the assurance of things unseen and for things hoped for. The conviction of things unseen and the assurance of things hoped for. So how then do we rest in that faith and not oppose the will of God by opposing the church or the Christians from the outside in? This is not the same, by the way, as being a prophetic voice and trying to push the church forward and speak out against things that may not be of God within the church or within a family or you know what I'm saying? So to be a prophetic voice is different than to just blatantly oppose it and not have the best of intentions for the church or for your family. That said, how we should respond to betrayal is this. I think this is, when we experience this, and it's raw, what does Jesus say? What is Jesus' posture and how we may relate to this? And Jesus responds to betrayal with an invitation to experience revelation. Peter, do you know what the will of the Father is? This is not it. Oh, okay, well, I thought I was helping. You're not. So do you want to know what the will of the Father is, Peter? Yes. Okay, so there's this invitation to experience revelation and an opportunity and choice for rebirth. So when God reveals God's self to us, and we experience God in a way that's profound, so much so that we are like taken back. that experience is memorable. And it has the opportunity to change us from the inside out, to transform us. And so there's this opportunity for rebirth. And then there's a peaceful resolve in God's calling. Jesus did not want to do what Jesus did. Yes, of course, you 600 or 200 people, I want you to take me, and I want you to arrest me, and I want you to torture me before you crucify me, and I'm an innocent man. But he had resolve in his calling. And luckily, most of us, if not all of us, don't have to suffer like that in the resolve that we may show to our calling. And what is the purpose of all this? All for the purpose of reconciliation and restoration, not retaliation and revenge. Now, a word about this. Reconciliation, I think we get into trouble sometimes. And I'm a big believer. There's this book called Boundaries. And I'm a big believer in boundaries. And sometimes reconciling, and we talk about forgiveness, and it means like, hey, there should be this unconditional forgiveness and reconciling. And when we say things like that, what we're doing is we're potentially urging people to make peace in particularly damaging or abusive situations that are harmful to their mental health. And that's not the case here. Reconciliation happens in both sides. So sometimes when we say reconciliation, it doesn't mean getting back together or like it all works out in the end. Reconciliation is this process of making peace with what is and having the peace about things over which we have no control. It's this posture and this acceptance of how things are. And so it says nothing about like getting back together but it's more about coming to peace and coming to terms with how God is changing you and your approach and your posture to any given situation. And so when you are reconciled to God, for example, let's say that something has happened and there is suffering in the world and you are cranked at God and you're like, God, if you're so good, why did this bad thing happen? Which is a very honest, real, and raw question that I don't begrudge anybody asking. And so how do we reconcile to God? You know, I was talking about this past week with somebody that in the book of Job asks these same questions. And he's like, God, why? If I thought you were good, and my friends tell me you're not, and so what's the answer? And then they have this conversation, and God's like, there are so many things that you cannot understand and cannot control. And honestly, the answer isn't really like, it doesn't make me feel better. Because the answer is essentially like, I'm God, you're not. Like, you can't know. But how then do we make peace with this idea that even though that bad things happen in the world, God's goodness is prevalent throughout? And that's a heavy question. But it's possible. And the purpose of which is not, it's like being at peace with God and not necessarily, I can still be mad. But I'm mad that I don't understand. But I'm convinced that maybe it's not God's fault. It's the fault of the world, sin in the world, and bad things happen in the world, and God can't save everything and everyone. So, how do we have reconciliation and restoration, not retaliation or revenge like Peter did? And how is this possible? Because as we see with the soldiers, human forces are powerless against the spiritual forces of God. We have to believe in the power of God, even when we feel called to do something that may be hard, that may be difficult, or we have faced pain in the way that Jesus has experienced pain. Jesus comes into Jerusalem and he's like, I'm a king, right? I don't think he said that. Maybe the donkey did, you know. How often do donkeys get to feel like they are royal? Okay, this is a serious message. You can laugh about that. I don't know. Terrible joke. But Jesus comes in, he's a king. And in a few short days, he is reduced to a slave, and worse, sent to his death. Only to demonstrate that he is bigger than any earthly title, neither king nor slave, but divine in God when he comes out of the tomb. And I think sometimes we relate that. That's a God thing. That's a Jesus thing. But I'm here to say, this is the cycle of what it means to have this point where God intervenes in our lives, where God takes our will and says, you know, it's either me or you, and we give it to God and we say, all right, God, I don't understand this. I can't control this. I'm going to give it to you. And I'm gonna pray about it, and I'm gonna try to accept things I don't understand. I'm gonna be reconciled to you, and I'm gonna believe, and then we get plugged in, and we go and we are part of the missional work of God, what God is doing here, and something starts happening and transforming, and the person that we were is a memory. It fades into the background because the person we have become is like the person that is coming out of the tomb. It is so much more glorious and so much more worthy of joy and so much more worthy of hope. We're all worthy of hope, but we experience it in a different way. That transformation happens through the power of God. I'll kind of close with this quote. Nelson Mandela. He was a leader against apartheid in South Africa, former president, recently passed away. And he once said, resentment is like drinking a poison and hoping it will kill our enemies. What can you say to that? Then how true is that? That resentment is like drinking a poison, is hoping that it will kill our enemies. That's why Jesus said to Peter, Peter, this is only going to make things worse and not better. In a sermon I once heard, the phrase that has always stuck with me is we have a choice in life when we encounter hard times, and we can get better or we can get better. And so we can choose not to be resentful. We can choose the way of life and hope, or we can choose the path of resentment. I know what God would choose for us. I know what God would choose for you. But the question this week as we lead into Easter is that the path you're willing to go? Let's pray. God, thank you for what you do and have done for us, how you are taking our pain and our bitterness, our betrayal and our resentment, and you're wanting to transform whatever mess we have into a message, into a testimony that says we are more than where we are, and that you will raise us into a life that is so much better because we have you in it. So God, as we come out of this break this week, help us to live into this week being mindful of you and the path that you took to the cross. But also, God, can't wait till Sunday because of how you overcame death and rose up out of that grave. God, we thank you.